ground material is dug out to accommodate the required pavement layers, ensuring it is evenly formed and compacted and any soft spots are made good. Setting out. Ensure sufficient setting out is undertaken. In this video, we're using pins and a string line to achieve the correct levels and falls. Tip: measure the depths of each layer from the top of the finished paved layer downwards. Take into consideration the materials being used and where the curb is going to sit in relation to the required pavement layers. Installing the subbase. Pour in the subbase and roughly distribute using a shovel or machine on site. Here we're using type 1 aggregate. Add more material as required and level off, making sure it's evenly distributed. To ensure solid compaction of the subbase, it is recommended that you compact no more than 75mm to 100mm at any one time. Measure the depth, making sure it's to the correct thickness. Compact the material using a vibrating plate to achieve a fully compacted smooth texture surface. Installing the road base. Pour in the road base layer. Here we've used a DBM concrete and roughly distribute with a rake across the entire area. This layer is normally machine laid but can be hand laid depending on the project's requirements. Tip: DBM concrete should be loose, not too stiff. Add more material as required and level off, making sure it's evenly distributed. Measure the depth, making sure it's to the correct thickness. If using a concrete, leave to cure for the specified time. Compact the material using a vibrating plate to achieve a fully compacted, smooth texture surface. Tip: one method to combat saturation of the sand laying course on an impermeable layer is to consider core drilling and the use of a geotextile. Here we want to prevent sand migration but allow water to drain naturally into the subbase layer. Once cured, drill a hole every 2 square meters through the road base layer with a drill cutter. Fill the drilled holes with 2 to 6mm single-sized aggregates and protect with a non-woven geotextile to prevent sand migration. Or you can use a coarse-graded sand as a suitable alternative. Installing the laying course. Pour in the laying course and roughly distribute with a shovel or machinery on site. Here we're using sharp sand. Carefully position 2 pins and create a straight string line. Drop in the screed rail. Measure from the top of the finished paved layer down to the top of the screed rail. This will help to ensure the next layer is installed to the correct compacted thickness. Screed out any excess material using a screeding rail, the top of the curb and a screeding bar. Ensure this layer is screeded to the correct thickness. Compact the material using a vibrating plate to achieve a fully compacted, smooth texture finish. Alternatively, sand can be loosely screeded, then blocks placed and then vibrated using the post-compaction method. Take out the screeding rail and make good the void that is left. Cover with sand and then screed over again for consistency, ensuring a smooth texture surface. Installing the finished paved layer. Install the blocks, creating a single laying face across the installation. Ensure the blocks are tightly connected to the adjacent block. Once the outer edge is reached, some blocks will need to be cut to size. Lay the blocks across the voids and mark up where the cuts need to be. Alternatively, measure the void to determine the size of the cut required, then mark up ready to be cut. There are 3 different methods of cutting blocks: a hammer and bolster, a block splitter, or a diamond-tipped cutting blade. If using a diamond-tipped cutting blade, use an appropriate dust suppression technique using water. Cut the blocks as accurately as possible, ensuring the correct PPE is worn. Install the blocks and cover the final installed area with jointing sand using a brush. Here we've used kiln-dried jointing sand. Make sure at all times when using kiln-dry or silica sand you wear a dust mask. Tip: for blocks with little or no chamfer, it's necessary to fill the joints with kiln-dried sand before compaction takes place. This is to prevent chipping. Compact using a vibrating plate, consolidating the sand into the joints. Dependent on the block being used, it is advisable to use a neoprene protection mat on the vibrating plate. top up the joints with more sand if required. Tip: during the early life of the pavement, keep topping up the joints with additional joint sand until they become self-stabilised. And here we have the completed installation. Only suitably trained and competent people should install building materials, using appropriate dust suppressant methods when cutting and appropriate lifting equipment where loads exceed manual handling limits. This video is intended to complement but not replace the BS 7533 series of standards, the Marshall's installation drawings and the engineer's contract drawings, which should all be referred to. Appropriate PPE should be worn at all times. In addition, it's essential that the contractor carries out their own risk assessment for all activities taking place on site. These demonstrations were undertaken on